In November 1932, the Australian military declared war, not on a foreign nation, not on a rebel army, not on any human enemy, on birds. 20,000 of them. Large, flightless, stubborn, fast, and as the Australian army was about to discover, essentially impossible to kill with a machine gun. Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery arrived in the Western Australian desert with 2 Lewis guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. He had been briefed on the situation. He had been told there were emus destroying farmers' crops across the Campion district. He had been sent by the Minister of Defence himself to resolve the problem. What no one had told him was that the emus were going to win. Within 6 days, his soldiers had fired 2,500 rounds of ammunition and killed, depending on who was counting, somewhere between 50 and 200 birds. Out of 20,000, the guns jammed. The emus scattered. The ones that were shot refused to die cleanly, absorbing bullets and continuing to run. The Australian press began printing headlines that would follow the military for years. Emus defeat the army. Machine gunners outwitted by birds. The operation was debated in the Australian Parliament. A member of Parliament asked whether medals would be awarded to the soldiers. Another suggested the medals should go to the emus, who had, as he noted, won every round so far. He was not wrong. This is the true, fully documented story of the Great Emu War of 1932. The only military conflict in modern history in which a democratic government mobilized its armed forces, equipped them with weapons designed for human warfare, and was comprehensively and publicly defeated by flightless birds. And it is one of the most extraordinary true stories in the history of the world. To understand how Australia ended up at war with emus, you need to understand how desperate the situation was before the first shot was fired. The year is 1932. The world is in the grip of the Great Depression, the worst economic collapse in recorded history. In Australia, unemployment has reached 32%. 60,000 people are surviving on government sustenance payments. Wheat prices, on which huge portions of the Australian economy depended, have collapsed on global markets as the United States, Canada, and Argentina flood the world with cheap grain. Australian farmers are selling wheat at a loss. Banks are calling in debts. The country is on the edge. And in the middle of all of this, in the remote Campion district of Western Australia, a semi-arid stretch of marginal land 500 kilometers northeast of Perth, there's a specific group of farmers who are having an even worse time than most. They are World War I veterans. After the war ended in 1918, the Australian government had made them a promise. You served your country. The promise went. You survived the trenches of Gallipoli and the Western Front. Now, here is land. Build a farm. Build a life. The government established 48 farming estates, covering almost 90,000 hectares of Western Australia and scrubland, and handed them to returning soldiers who, in many cases, had no farming experience at all. The land was hard. The climate was unpredictable. The government subsidies they had been promised repeatedly failed to materialize. By 1932, 1/4 of the farmers in the Campion district had already abandoned their properties. The ones who remained were holding on by their fingernails, gambling that the wheat harvest would be enough to keep them solvent for one more year. Then the emus arrived, 20,000 of them. Every year, after their breeding season along the coast, vast flocks of Australian emus migrate inland in search of food and water. In most years, the migration passed through regions with enough space and resources that the impact on any one area was manageable. But 1932 had been a drought year. The normal food and water sources across the interior were dry. The emus kept moving, following the scent of water and the sight of green. They found the wheat belt, the farms of the Campion district, with their irrigation systems, their green fields of ripening grain, and their water troughs were exactly what 20,000 migrating emus needed. The birds descended on the farms in numbers that farmers describe as an invasion. An estimated 500 emus per square mile in some areas. They ate the wheat. They trampled the crops. They tore through the fences that the farmers had painstakingly built to keep rabbits out, creating gaps that let rabbits pour in and cause their own destruction. One local newspaper reported at the time, "Emus, in thousands, are making simultaneous attacks, devouring the wheat crops and destroying fences in all directions. So serious is the position that the farmers are compelled to keep a constant watch day and night on their crops." The farmers who had survived the Western Front, who had rebuilt their lives on promises made by the government, who were already staring down the barrel of economic ruin, had had enough. A deputation of soldier settlers traveled to Perth to meet with the Minister of Defence, Sir George Pearce. Their request was direct. They knew what machine guns could do. They wanted machine guns, and Pearce, who saw an opportunity to show the government was supporting its veterans, while also giving his troops some practical field exercise, said yes. The plan, in its original conception, was so simple it barely qualified as a plan at all. Send soldiers with machine guns to where the emus are, open fire, The problem solves itself. Major Meredith, assigned to lead the operation, was a man who had commanded artillery in actual warfare. He had no reason to believe that 20,000 large birds would present any particular tactical challenge. He arrived in Campion with his 2 soldiers, his 2 Lewis guns, the same weapons that had mowed down human soldiers in the trenches of the First World War, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. He was accompanied by a cinematographer. The Minister of Defense wanted footage of the successful operation to show to the press. The operation began on November 2nd, 1932.
The soldiers arrived at a location near Campion where scouts had reported a flock of around 50 emus. The Lewis guns were set up. The gunners waited for the birds to come into range. The emus were out of range. The soldiers waited. The birds stayed where they were. Eventually, the troops advanced. The emus, noticing the movement, walked away. Not in panic, just away, at the unhurried pace of an animal that is not particularly afraid of anything and has no idea what a machine gun is. The soldiers advanced further. The emus moved further. By the time the first shots were fired, the birds had already put enough distance between themselves and the guns that most rounds missed entirely. A few emus were killed. The rest scattered in every direction simultaneously, not in a stampede, but in dozens of small groups, each peeling away from the main body and disappearing into the scrubland at speed. A fully running emu, it turns out, can reach 45 miles per hour. The Lewis gun, mounted on a fixed position, was not designed to track fast-moving targets that split in multiple directions at once. Day 1, a handful of emus dead, 10,000 still out there. 2 days later, Meredith's scouts reported a flock of roughly 1,000 emus moving toward a nearby dam. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The soldiers set up their ambush with care, positioning the guns at point-blank range and waiting in silence as the massive flock approached the water. 1,000 emus, machine guns, point-blank range. The gunners opened fire. The machine gun jammed after 12 rounds. 1,000 emus scattered. By the end of the first week, after firing 2,500 rounds of ammunition, the soldiers had killed somewhere between 50 and 200 birds. 200 out of 20,000. And the ammunition expenditure, around 10 to 50 rounds per confirmed kill, depending on who was counting, was so far outside what any sensible military operation could justify that the story was already making headlines back in the cities. The Australian press was not kind. Only a few killed, reported one paper. Another noted that the emus appeared to be learning, the Melbourne Age observed, with barely concealed amusement, that the emus had demonstrated remarkable resilience and tactical flexibility against the supposedly overwhelming firepower of the Australian military. The operation was called to a halt. Meredith withdrew. The matter went to Parliament. What happened in that parliamentary debate deserves to be read slowly, because it is one of the few moments in legislative history where the official record of a democratic government contains the following type of exchange. A senator named James Dunn took to calling the Minister of Defense the Minister for the Emu War. The Prime Minister was asked whether medals would be awarded to the soldiers. A member from New South Wales rose to inquire whether the government's attention had been drawn to the reports about this war and whether the Prime Minister would confirm that the emus had indeed won. A counterpart from Western Australia asked whether medals were forthcoming, said they should rightly go to the emus, who have won every round so far. Meanwhile, back in the field, ornithologist Dominic Cervanti published his own assessment of the operation. His language was impeccably scientific, but his message was unmistakable. The machine gunner's dreams of point-blank fire into serried masses of emus were soon dissipated, he wrote. The Emu Command had evidently ordered guerrilla tactics, and its unwieldy army soon split up into innumerable small units that made use of the military equipment uneconomic. A crestfallen field force therefore withdrew from the combat area after about a month. He used the phrase Emu Command. An ornithologist, describing birds, used military command structure as the most accurate framework he had for what he had observed. Because what Meredith and his men had encountered was not simply animals running from noise and danger. The emus had, apparently, a system. Individual birds taller than the others, standing at the edges of flocks, appeared to be watching for threats. At the first sign of the soldiers, these sentinel birds would alert the flock, which would disperse into small, fast-moving groups before the guns could be brought to bear. Each small group moved independently, making it impossible to concentrate fire. When soldiers attempted to mount a Lewis gun on the back of a truck to pursue fleeing birds across the scrubland, the terrain defeated them. The ground was too rough for accurate shooting, and the emus simply outran the vehicle. The birds that were hit by bullets frequently did not fall. Full-grown emu stands 6 feet tall, weighs over 100 pounds, and is built with a muscular frame and dense plumage. That distributes the impact of a bullet in ways that a smaller animal could not survive. Major Meredith, in his reports to superiors, noted with a mixture of frustration and something approaching admiration that the birds could absorb rounds and continue running. He was forced to revise, repeatedly upward, his estimate of the ammunition required per confirmed kill. In a letter to his commanding officers, Meredith explained the core tactical problem with the kind of directness that only a man who has been publicly humiliated by birds could produce. "It must be realized that an emu full out can do 45 miles per hour," he wrote. Consequently, the target is, after the first burst, a very rapidly moving one, and is only visible for a very short time. The target was too fast. The flock was too many. The terrain was too rough. In the ammunition, 10,000 rounds, the figure that had seemed so obviously sufficient when the operation was planned, was running out. The government, under pressure from farmers who were still watching their wheat disappear, authorized a second deployment. Meredith went back, this time with a strategy adapted to what the first campaign had taught him. Instead of attacking large concentrations of emus directly, he set up ambushes at water points, places the birds had to visit, and waited. He deployed in smaller engagements, killing in dozens at a time, rather than attempting mass fire against scattered targets.
This phase went better. By the time the second campaign ended, on December 10, 1932, Meredith filed an official report claiming 986 confirmed kills, using 9,860 rounds of ammunition. Historians have noted with the same dry amusement that characterized the parliamentary debates that the figure of exactly 986 kills, representing precisely 10% of rounds fired, is a suspiciously round number. Meredith himself acknowledged, in describing his tally, that many wounded birds had likely wandered off to die elsewhere and been uncounted. Whatever the precise number, the conclusion was inescapable. The operation had fired nearly 10,000 rounds of World War I machine gun ammunition at Australian. The emu population of the Campion district had not been materially reduced. The birds were still there. The crops were still being eaten. The farmers were still desperate. The military was not sent back again. Major Meredith, on his departure, gave the emus the highest tribute he was capable of giving. It was the tribute of a professional soldier to a foe he had failed to defeat. "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds," he said, "it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. They are like Zulus, whom even dum-dum bullets could not stop." He compared them to the Zulus. 2 tanks. They were birds. The aftermath of the Great Emu War is, in its own way, as remarkable as the war itself. The Australian government learned from the experience. The military was never deployed against emus again. Instead, the farmers were given ammunition and left to manage the problem themselves, which they did with considerably more efficiency than the Lewis gun campaign. Approximately 284,000 emus were killed by farmers and hunters in Western Australia using conventional rifles. The lesson was not that emus were. The lesson was that they were unkillable by the particular approach. The government had chosen overwhelming machine gun firepower applied in large-massed engagements against a fast, dispersing, adaptive target in broken terrain. The emus, in other words, did not beat the machine guns because they were more powerful than the machine guns. They beat the machine guns because the machine guns were the wrong tool, deployed by the wrong number of people, using the wrong tactics, in the wrong terrain, against an animal whose behavior made every one of those tactical assumptions incorrect. Australia in 1932 looked at 20,000 emus and thought, machine guns. Simple. Nature responded by doing what nature always does when a human being decides the problem is simpler than it is. It got more complicated. There's a version of this story that treats it purely as comedy. The incompetent soldiers, the unkillable birds, the jammed machine gun at the critical moment, the parliamentary jokes, the ornithologist writing about Emu Command. And it is funny. Genuinely, brilliantly funny. One of the most absurd true stories in any country's military history. But there's another version of this story that is worth sitting with. The men who deployed to the Campion district in November 1932 were not incompetent. Major Meredith was an experienced artillery officer. His soldiers were professionals. The Lewis gun was one of the most effective automatic weapons of its era, proven in the bloodiest warfare of the 20th century. The plan to use it against birds was not obviously wrong by any standard available to the people who made the decision, and the farmers who had requested the military were not foolish. They were World War I veterans who had survived some of the worst combat in history, then spent more than a decade building farms on land the government had given them, in conditions harder than anyone had promised, for a payday that kept not coming. When 20,000 birds arrived to eat the last thing between them and financial ruin, they turned to the one solution they had experience with: soldiers and guns. The problem was not the soldiers. The problem was not the guns. The problem was a gap between what the solution looked like on paper and what the actual situation on the ground required. A machine gun is a perfect tool for a target that stands still, moves in predictable directions, and does not scatter into dozens of fast-moving independent groups at the first sign of trouble. Against a target that does none of those things, all the firepower in the world is just noise. Mao Zedong declared war on sparrows with the entire population of China as his weapon, and triggered a famine that killed tens of millions. Pablo Escobar imported for hippos and created an ecological disaster that is still unfolding today. The US government killed the last wolves in Yellowstone and accidentally destroyed the rivers. Australia sent machine guns after emus and fired 10,000 rounds. The pattern, in every case, is human certainty colliding with biological reality. The certainty that the problem is understood. The certainty that the solution is proportionate. The certainty that nature will respond to force the way a human opponent would. And nature, in every case, does not get the memo. The Great Emu War lasted from November 2nd to December 10th, 1932. Emu population outcome, essentially unchanged. The birds continued migrating through the Campion district for decades afterward. Today, the emu is one of Australia's national symbols. It appears on the country's coat of arms alongside the kangaroo, chosen, partly, because it is an animal that cannot walk backward. The emu only moves forward. In 1932, that turned out to be literally true against machine guns. If this story made you laugh, or think, or both, share it. Because this is the kind of story that should be in every history book in the world and somehow never is. And the next time someone tells you that a problem is simple, that the solution is obvious, that all you need is enough firepower, remember the emu. They faced Lewis machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks. They won. And they did it by doing nothing more complicated than what emus have always done. They just kept moving.